Out on the edge of a growing suburban sprawl lay a piece of land that had stood quiet for decades. To most passers-by, it was just a stretch of grass and soil, a few trees dotting the landscape, and an old, weathered gate that rarely swung open. It didn't have a house, a driveway, or any sign of daily life. To the homeowners association that had recently claimed dominion over the neighboring subdivision, it looked empty, prime for development, or at least ripe for being folded under their authority. But what they didn't know was that the land wasn't vacant. It belonged to someone who had inherited it through family, someone who had grown up walking its fields, repairing its fences, and carrying with him the responsibility that came with it. That someone was away, serving his country overseas in the military. While he was deployed, the land sat in quiet patience, waiting for his return. The ownership was secure, the deed was recorded, and taxes were paid on time. There was no question of neglect or abandonment. The HOA, however, saw things differently. They were new to the area, formed only in the past decade as suburban houses popped up in rows where farmland once stretched freely. Their rules, their bylaws, and their sense of control made them believe they had a say far beyond their boundaries. They had lawns to regulate, fences to measure, and colors to approve. And soon, they set their sights on that parcel of land just outside their manicured streets. To them, it was a nuisance. It didn't fit the clean, uniform look of their subdivision. There was no one mowing weekly, no trimmed hedges, no painted fences. It looked wild, untamed, and to their eyes, forgotten. In HOA meetings, it became a point of discussion, with certain board members insisting that something had to be done. And when Karen, the loudest voice among them, declared it vacant and abandoned, the room agreed without question. What followed was a decision that would set everything in motion. The HOA board, believing their authority extended further than it did, began paperwork to claim the land as neglected property. They crafted their story carefully, citing community standards and presenting the land as a liability to property values. They moved fast, filing documents, leaning on local officials who didn't question their claims, and eventually staging what they believed was a lawful sale. The land, according to them, was theirs to manage now. They sold it off quietly to a developer with promises of adding amenities for the community. Money changed hands, plans were drafted, and the subdivision buzzed with talk of how the new expansion would look. But in the background, the truth remained unchanged. The land was not abandoned. It was not theirs to claim. It was owned, protected, and tied directly to someone who was far from home, but not disconnected. When the military man returned, he would find not just an HOA stepping beyond its bounds, but an entire subdivision built on arrogance and false authority. The seeds of conflict had been planted. The HOA believed they had won, believing the land was vacant and theirs for the taking. But they had no idea whose land they had just stolen, or what kind of fight they had invited onto themselves, because the man who owned it wasn't just another homeowner. He was someone who understood rules, laws, and the weight of authority in ways they never could. And when he discovered what they had done, his response wouldn't be petty or impulsive. It would be calculated. It would be powerful. And it would change the fate of their subdivision forever. The HOA had made a critical mistake, one they wouldn't realize until it was far too late. And as the first signs of their development started to appear on the stolen land, the stage was set for a battle they could never have prepared for. The land wasn't vacant. It wasn't abandoned. It was his. And soon, they would learn just how costly their mistake would be. The sale went through faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, surveyors showed up on the land, planting flags and stretching out tape measures across fields that were never theirs to touch. The HOA board, beaming with self-importance, paraded around the site as though they had conquered some forgotten territory. Karen, of course, took the most credit, boasting online about how the HOA had cleaned up an eyesore and secured land that would finally benefit the community. For the neighbors living within the subdivision, it was another notch in the HOA's belt. To them, the board always seemed to find ways of tightening control, fencing disputes, mailboxes, and lawn standards. But this felt bigger. They saw heavy machinery roll in, and thought it was progress. They didn't ask questions. They didn't think about who had really owned the land. But paper doesn't lie. Deeds don't vanish simply because someone wishes them away. And when the soldier returned from deployment months later, tired from long stretches overseas but eager to set foot again on familiar soil, the first thing he did was drive out to see the land he had missed so much. Only it wasn't the same. Where tall grass once swayed, the earth had been scarred by bulldozers. Fences were gone. Trees had been cut down to make way for paved paths. And posted on the gate, his gate, was a bright new HOA sign claiming the property as community expansion. And all year, first, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Surely the subdivision had pushed too close to the boundary line, or perhaps a neighbor had confused the property line. But when he went home and opened his mailbox, the answer came quick and brutal. Thick envelopes stuffed with notices, plans, and glossy brochures from the HOA. They were bragging about the acquisition, showing mock-ups of a future recreation center and community playground to be built where his land once stood. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief hardened into anger. He went straight to the county office, deed in hand, and laid it on the counter. The clerks pulled records, combed through files, and frowned at what they saw. His deed was valid, current, and unquestionable. But the HOA had filed its own claims, calling the land abandoned. Somewhere along the line, officials had stamped their paperwork without verifying the truth. To them, it had been a routine process, a neighborhood board requesting clearance on an unused parcel. Nobody had thought to question it. The soldier did more than question it. He demanded answers. He demanded records. And when the documents were laid out in front of him, he saw the entire fraudulent paper trail for himself. The HOA had signed off on affidavits declaring the land vacant. They had pushed through paperwork insisting no taxes had been paid, even though receipts proved otherwise. They had lied, deliberately and repeatedly, to get what they wanted. It wasn't just arrogance, it was theft. He left the office that day with copies of every document, his jaw set, his fury controlled but sharp. He knew enough from his training to understand the value of evidence. Every form, every date, every false claim was another weapon in his arsenal. The HOA had overstepped, but they hadn't covered their tracks. And now, he held proof in his hands. Back in the subdivision, the board members carried on as though nothing was wrong. Karen strutted across freshly cleared ground, talking loudly about where benches would go, where landscaping would be planted, and how lucky the community was to have such vision. She had no idea that the rightful owner had returned. She had no idea that her paper empire was already collapsing under the weight of its own lies. But he didn't act right away. He didn't storm the property or confront them at their meetings. Instead, he watched, waited, and documented. He photographed the machines tearing into his soil. He filmed the board trespassing across his boundaries, and every day, his file of evidence grew thicker. It wasn't just about stopping them anymore. It was about making sure they paid for every inch of damage, every hour of arrogance, every dollar spent on a fraud that would come back to destroy them. And he had one advantage they hadn't even considered. He wasn't just a landowner. He was military. His service, his connections, and the laws protecting property owned by deployed service members put him in a category far outside the HOA's reach. There were federal protections Karen and her board had never even thought about, meant to ensure soldiers weren't cheated while serving their country. The more he read, the clearer it became. The HOA hadn't just crossed a line. They had broken laws that carried serious consequences. For now, though, the subdivision remained blissfully ignorant. Children rode bikes past construction equipment, neighbors chatted about how nice the new park would look, and the HOA prepared for its next meeting where Karen would no doubt deliver another triumphant speech. But the soldier wasn't planning to interrupt with words. He was planning to act with something far more powerful than speeches. As he sat at his kitchen table that evening, his deed and evidence spread before him, he picked up his phone and dialed a number few ordinary homeowners would ever have access to. It wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't the county. It was a contact from his service. someone who understood what it meant when a service member's rights had been trampled by local overreach. And with that single call, the wheels began turning. The HOA thought they had won. They thought they had stolen a piece of land without consequence. But they were about to find out that this wasn't just about property lines anymore. It was about federal law. It was about military authority. And soon, the very ground they stood on would be pulled out from beneath them. The HOA had stolen from the wrong man, and the wrong man had just come home. The subdivision continued to buzz with excitement as the HOA moved ahead with its plans. Surveyors hammered stakes into the soil. Graders rumbled across the land, scraping away topsoil that had been untouched for decades. To the homeowners who believed the HOA's story, it felt like progress. To the soldier watching from a distance, it was destruction. But now he was done watching. The first step in his fight was documentation. Every night he compiled the evidence he had gathered into folders, videos of bulldozers tearing through his fences, photographs of HOA board members standing smugly on his land, copies of fraudulent affidavits filed with the county. He didn't just gather proof. He organized it like a case file, every piece of information labeled and cross-referenced, just as he had learned to do during his years of service. This wasn't anger driving him anymore. It was discipline. Once his files were airtight, he reached out to a military legal office, explaining the situation in detail. When the attorneys there saw the documents, they immediately recognized the significance. The HOA hadn't just overstepped. They had violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act, a federal law designed to protect military personnel from exactly this kind of exploitation while deployed. The land couldn't legally be sold, seized, or reclassified while he was serving abroad. The HOA had crossed into federal territory, and that meant serious consequences. The attorneys wasted no time. Letters were drafted and sent to the HOA, stamped with military insignias that left no room for doubt. The tone was firm, cold, and unyielding. They spelled out the violations clearly: fraudulent filings, trespassing, property destruction, and violation of federal protections for service members. They gave the HOA one demand: vacate the land immediately and prepare for a full legal reckoning. When the letter arrived, the HOA board was stunned. For the first time, they realized their victory wasn't as clean as they thought. But instead of backing down, Karen doubled down. At the next board meeting, she scoffed at the military's warning, telling homeowners it was nothing more than a bluff. She claimed the soldier had abandoned his land, that the HOA had acted in the community's best interest, and that no court would side with someone who had been gone for years. Her arrogance blinded her. She didn't realize that, by ignoring the letter, she had escalated the fight into something much bigger. Within weeks, county officials began showing up, not to inspect the ditch or the subdivision's landscaping, but to investigate the fraudulent paperwork the HOA had filed. They asked questions the board couldn't answer. They pulled tax records that proved the land had been paid on time. They compared signatures and dates, uncovering inconsistencies that pointed directly to forgery and perjury. The subdivision grew tense. Neighbors whispered about legal trouble and federal involvement. Construction equipment sat idle, the half-finished worksite abandoned as rumors spread about lawsuits and investigations. For the first time, cracks appeared in the HOA's iron grip, and the soldier wasn't done. He contacted local media, sharing his story quietly with a reporter who specialized in uncovering corruption. The article hit the front page of the county paper within days. HOA accused of selling soldiers' land while he served overseas. The headline sparked outrage. Letters to the editor poured in, condemning the HOA for targeting someone who had been defending the country. Online forums lit up with angry comments, homeowners calling for accountability, demanding Karen's resignation. The board tried to spin the story, but it was too late. The narrative had shifted. They weren't protectors of the community anymore. They were bullies who had stolen from a service member. And then, the soldier made his boldest move yet. He filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA and its board members personally. The complaint didn't just demand the return of his land, It sought damages for trespassing, destruction of property, emotional distress, and fraud. His attorneys requested liens against the personal assets of board members, meaning Karen and her allies could face financial ruin if the case went against them. For the first time, the HOA realized the danger they were in. Their usual tactics, letters, threats, fines, meant nothing here. They were up against federal protections, civil litigation, and a man who refused to be bullied. As fall turned into winter, the subdivision transformed from a place of smug control into a community gripped by fear. Neighbors began distancing themselves from the board, whispering about resignations and lawsuits. Some homeowners even reached out to the soldier privately, offering support and apologizing for not asking questions. Sooner, Karen, however, refused to yield. She stormed through meetings with fiery speeches, claiming the HOA was the victim, that the soldier was exploiting his status, that the media had twisted the truth. But her voice grew shriller with each passing week, her authority slipping away, as board members quietly resigned, unwilling to be dragged deeper into the mess. The soldier, meanwhile, remained calm and patient. He didn't gloat. He didn't argue. He simply let the evidence, the law, and the truth do the work. And yet, behind his steady resolve, he was planning something else. Something the HOA hadn't even considered. Because while the lawsuit moved slowly through the courts, he knew there was another way to remind the HOA of exactly whose land they had stolen. His ranch wasn't just private property, it was tied to military contracts, land that the government had an interest in preserving. And if he chose, he could leverage that connection in a way that would shake the entire subdivision to its core. The fight was no longer about just winning back what was his. It was about teaching the HOA a lesson they would never forget. And soon, the very ground beneath their subdivision would remind them of their mistake. The fight had begun in earnest, and the soldier wasn't stopping until the HOA's empire of arrogance collapsed completely.